It was early January of 1971 when Geraldine Liston came home to a house that felt wrong before she even reached the door. There, on the front step of the quiet Las Vegas home, sat a pile of newspapers, stacked one on top of another, untouched. Inside, the kitchen told the same silent story. Bottles of milk gone sour, sitting out in the open. Small, ordinary things, and every one of them whispered the same impossible truth. No one had walked through that house in days. She had been away, out of state, traveling with the family. Now she moved through the rooms, calling a name that no longer answered. And when she reached the bedroom, she found her husband, Charles Sonny Liston, the man once called the most feared fighter alive, lying still in his bed. The former heavyweight champion of the world was gone. The official cause of passing, recorded by the Clark County coroner, was lung congestion and heart failure. On paper, it sounded almost gentle, natural, the kind of ending that closes a file and ends a conversation. But almost no one who truly knew Sonny Liston ever accepted that conclusion. Because the scene inside that home didn't add up, and the man inside that bed had spent his entire life surrounded by shadows that don't usually let go. How does a man who terrified the toughest fighters on earth end up gone and undiscovered for days? How does a passing get filed as natural when the people closest to him swore until their own dying days that it was anything but? To answer that, we have to go back through the Mafia handlers who owned a piece of him, back through 2 world titles and the most disputed knockouts in boxing history, back to a plantation in Arkansas where this story began with something missing from every official record. Because before we can understand how Sonny Liston passed away, we have to understand a man who may never have known the year he was born. He came into the world somewhere around 1930 on the poor, exhausted land of Mortgage Plantation near Johnson Township in St. Francis County, Arkansas, a sharecropper's son. And here is the first strange truth in a life full of them. There is no official record of his birth. None. Arkansas did not make birth certificates mandatory until 1965, so a baby born to a black sharecropping family in that hard country simply slipped into existence, unrecorded. For the rest of his life, Sonny Liston could not say for certain how old he was. He himself believed his birthday to be May the 8th, 1932, and that's the date he used on official papers. But later analysis of census records pointed elsewhere, to July the 22nd, 1930. His family appears in the 1930 census, and by the 1940 count, a young Sonny is listed as 10 years old. Some who studied his life came to believe he genuinely did not know, and by the time he won the heavyweight crown, his weathered, aged face fed the rumors that he was older than he ever admitted. His father was Tobe Liston, a man who fathered dozens of children across 2 marriages. Sonny was the second youngest. But it was not love that he remembered from that home. It was punishment. The whippings his father gave him were so severe that the scars were still visible on his body decades later. In one of the most haunting things he ever said about his childhood, Liston put it plainly. "The only thing my old man ever gave me," he said, "was a beating." That was the foundation. No recorded birthday, no tenderness, no schooling worth the name, just hard fields and a hard hand. And when he finally escaped that plantation and made his way to the city to find his mother, he discovered something that would shape everything that followed. He stepped into a world where he could not read a single sign hung over a single door. and that one fact would push him toward the only doors that ever opened for him. In the middle of the 1940s, his mother Helen had gone north to St. Louis looking for factory work, and young Sonny followed, desperate to be near her again. But the city was not a fresh start. It was a wall. He tried going to school. It didn't last. The jeers about his illiteracy drove him out almost as soon as he walked in. A grown-sized boy who couldn't read, mocked by children half his size. So he left. And the only work a man like that could find was sporadic, low, and exploitative. No education, no connections, no way up the legitimate ladder. So he found another ladder. Liston fell in with trouble and soon was leading a small gang that committed muggings and armed robberies across the city. He became known to the St. Louis police, who tagged him with a nickname that stuck to his file, the Yellow Shirt Bandit. For a while, that life ran fast and reckless. But that kind of life always collects its debt. In January of 1950, the law caught up with him. He was convicted, and the sentence came down hard. 5 years in the Missouri State Penitentiary. A young man who couldn't read his own court papers was now headed behind those walls, his future seemingly written and shut. And yet, this is where the impossible turn of his life begins. Because inside that grim institution, far from anything that looked like hope, a priest would take notice of the size of a young inmate's hands. And what that priest suggested next would transform a convicted robber into the most feared heavyweight the world had ever seen. His name was Reverend Alois Stevens, and he served as the athletic director at the Missouri State Penitentiary. He was also a priest. And when he looked at the enormous young man in front of him, he didn't see a hopeless case. He saw raw, untapped power. Stevens suggested that Liston try boxing. The results were immediate, and they were stunning. Liston's aptitude in the ring was so obvious that it could not be ignored. With Stevens's endorsement behind him, that talent helped earn Liston an early parole. He walked free on the 31st of October, 1952. And what the prison ring had revealed was nothing short of a physical phenomenon. Liston stood 6 feet 1 inch tall, but the measurements that mattered defied belief. He carried a disproportionately long reach of 84 inches, arms that could reach an opponent long before that opponent could ever reach him. And his fists measured 15 inches around, among the most imposing measurements ever recorded for a heavyweight champion. Nature had built a weapon, and confinement had finally uncovered it. What followed was a lightning-fast amateur career that lasted less than a single year. On the 6th of March, 1953, Liston captured the Chicago Golden Gloves Tournament of Champions, and he did it by defeating Ed Sanders, the very man who had won the Olympic heavyweight gold in 1952. A convicted robber, barely months out of confinement, had just beaten an Olympic champion. The legend was beginning. But the men who would step forward to fund his professional dream were not priests, and they were not honest promoters. They were the only people in America who saw real value in a man like Sonny Liston, and the price of their backing was that they would own a piece of him for the rest of his life. On the 2nd of September, 1953, Sonny Liston made his professional debut. It lasted barely a moment. He knocked out an opponent named Don Smith in the first round in St. Louis, the city where he would fight his first 5 bouts. The pattern was set early. Men stepped into the ring with him, and very quickly, they fell. But behind that rising fighter stood a hard and ugly truth about how he got there. The only people willing to put up the money a man needs to turn professional were those close to the underworld. And Liston, in those years, did more than just take their backing. He supplemented his income by working for racketeers as an intimidator, an enforcer, a presence whose very size made arguments end. In the beginning, those connections were an advantage. They opened doors, paid bills, and arranged fights. But that same bargain would one day be turned against him, used as the reason champions and commissions kept him at arm's length. The names attached to him were not small ones. His handlers were drawn into the orbit of organized crime's most notorious figures. His managers were subpoenaed to testify in the grand jury trial of the Mafia soldier Frankie Carbo. And before long, Liston was shifted to a new manager, Joseph Pep Barone, a man who served as a front for Carbo and for Frank Blinky Palermo. In other words, the fighter belonged, in every way that mattered, to the men in the shadows. It was a devil's bargain. The talent was his. The fists were his. But a piece of Sonny Liston, from the very start of his professional life, was signed away to people who would never truly let him go. And as he climbed, unstoppable, toward the top of the heavyweight division, he would discover the cruelest twist of all, that the closer he got to the championship of the world, the more America would decide it did not want him to wear that crown at all. By 1960, the arithmetic of the heavyweight division had become impossible to argue with. Sonny Liston had flattened everyone they placed in front of him, and he stood, undeniably, as the #1 contender in the world. By every rule of the sport, he had earned a shot at the title. And by every rule that mattered outside the ring, he was told it would never come. The champion was Floyd Patterson, a quiet, dignified man whose handlers wanted nothing to do with the menace climbing up beneath them. Their reason was not Liston's skill. It was his reputation, those well-documented links to organized crime that trailed him like a shadow no victory could shake. The barrier in front of Sonny Liston was not built of talent. It was built of fear and of the company he kept. And then the opposition grew into something almost unbelievable. This was not simply one champion ducking one challenger. The NAACP itself urged Patterson not to grant the fight, fearing that a Liston victory would damage the civil rights movement at its most fragile hour. Many African Americans openly disdained him, unwilling to see a man with his record become the face of the race in the boxing world. And it climbed higher still. In January of 1962, when Patterson met with President John F. Kennedy at the White House, the president himself suggested Patterson avoid Liston, citing the Justice Department's concerns about his underworld ties. Think on the weight of that. A poor, illiterate son of an Arkansas plantation was being shut out of his life's one great opportunity by the most powerful office in the country. Liston answered the only way he could, through the press. He pointed out that Patterson, since becoming champion, had faced mostly white challengers, and he accused the champion of drawing the color line against his own race. It was a sharp and painful counterpunch. Here was a black contender locked out by the white establishment and disowned by much of his own community at the very same time. A man with no comfortable place to stand. When the fight he was told would never happen was finally signed for September of 1962, the question was no longer whether Liston could win. It was whether the world was ready for what he would do in just over 2 minutes. The signing finally came. Floyd Patterson agreed to defend his title against Sonny Liston on the 25th of September, 1962, at Comiskey Park in Chicago. After years of being told no by champions, by commissions, by presidents, the most feared man in boxing was at last going to get his chance under the lights. He arrived in that ring carrying a heavy physical advantage. Liston weighed 214 pounds to Patterson's 189, a difference of 25 pounds of muscle and menace. The crowd settled in, expecting a fight. What they got was an execution. It was over almost before it began. At 2 minutes and 6 seconds of the very first round, a single left hook from Sonny Liston ended the night. Floyd Patterson, the reigning heavyweight champion of the world, crumpled to the canvas and was counted out. It stands among the fastest knockouts in heavyweight title history ever seen, a stunning first-round destruction of a sitting champion that left the arena stunned into a kind of disbelief. In that instant, Sonny Liston became the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. The convicted robber who couldn't read, the man backed by the underworld, the contender the establishment had tried so hard to keep out. He now wore the most coveted crown in all of sports. The most intimidating figure boxing had ever produced had reached the very summit. He should have been on top of the world. By any measure of the sport, he had silenced every doubter with one swing of his arm. And as he prepared to fly home, he believed the hardest part was finally behind him. He carried a victory speech in his pocket, written and ready, certain that a hero's welcome was waiting for the new champion of the world. But what greeted Sonny Liston at that airport would break something in him that no opponent ever could. Friends had assured him it would be magnificent. A crowd, they promised, would be waiting at the Philadelphia airport to greet their new heavyweight champion of the world. So Liston came home with that speech folded and ready, rehearsed for the cheering throng he was certain stood just beyond the gate. There was no throng. When he stepped off that plane, he was met by only a handful of reporters and public relations staff. No banners, no roar, no parade for the man who had just conquered the toughest sport on earth. Those who were there never forgot what they saw. They described his shoulders slumping, the joy draining out of him in real time, the speech in his pocket now worthless. Many who studied his life mark that quiet, devastating moment at the gate as the instant Sonny Liston abandoned all hope of ever being accepted as champion. To understand why that empty airport cut so deep, you have to understand the wound beneath it. For years, in an era when white journalists routinely described black athletes through cruel stereotypes, Liston had been a constant target of racially charged, deeply dehumanizing language in print. He had been cast, again and again, as a villain, a brute, a thing to be feared rather than a man to be admired. The empty terminal was simply the final confirmation of everything that language had told him, that no title, no matter how great, would ever buy him a place in America's heart. So he stopped reaching for it. He relocated permanently to Denver, putting distance between himself and the city that had turned its back. And he summed up his exile in a line that has outlived nearly everything else about him. "I'd rather be a lamppost in Denver," he said, "than the mayor of Philadelphia." A world champion had chosen quiet exile over a place that did not want him. And yet, for one brief moment in 1963, the man America insisted on calling a monster would reveal something nobody expected to find inside him. A conscience, stirred awake by what was happening to children in a church in Alabama. In September of 1963, a bomb tore through the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, killing 4 young girls and shocking the conscience of the nation. It was one of the darkest racial crimes of the entire civil rights era, a horror that reached far beyond the South. At that moment, Sonny Liston was overseas, in the middle of a European boxing exhibition tour. Exactly the kind of profitable, image-building venture a reigning champion was expected to see through to the end. But when word of the bombing reached him, the heavyweight champion of the world did something that did not fit the brute the headlines had built. He broke off the tour and returned home. And he was quoted with a line that still cuts through every cruel caricature ever written about him. He said he was ashamed to be in America. Sit with the contradiction in that. Here was a man painted relentlessly as a senseless destroyer, a fighter without thought or feeling, functionally unable to read the very newspapers that demonized him. And yet, when his country revealed one of its ugliest faces, he responded not with indifference, but with a moral wound. The monster of the sports pages carried something his critics never bothered to look for: a sense of right and wrong, and a quiet pride in his own people that the establishment had never credited him with. It is one of the great tragedies of his story that this side of Sonny Liston was so rarely allowed to surface. The public had already decided who he was. The press had already written his role. There was no room in that script for a champion who grieved for 4 little girls and felt his own nation had failed them. But the world did not pause to reconsider him. The fight game does not stop for conscience, and the most dangerous chapter of his career was already taking shape. Because waiting for him in Miami in the winter of 1964 was a brash young challenger most experts had already dismissed, and a night that would turn the invincible champion into a question mark forever. Before we get to that night in Miami, look first at the proof of how complete his dominance had become. In their rematch, Liston met Floyd Patterson again, this time for the richest payday the sport had yet seen, a purse said to be the first to cross $1 million, with each man reportedly taking home around $1.5 million. And once again, Patterson barely survived a single round. Knocked down 3 times, he was counted out at 2 minutes and 10 seconds of the very first. 2 title fights, 2 first-round demolitions of a former champion. Sonny Liston looked, for all the world, like a man who could not be beaten. That was the backdrop when, on the 25th of February, 1964, he stepped into a ring in Miami Beach to defend his crown against a loud, lightning-quick young challenger named Cassius Clay, soon to be known to history as Muhammad Ali. The odds makers made Liston an 8-to-1 favorite. Of 46 sports writers polled before the bell, 43 picked him to win by knockout. Nobody, it seemed, gave the brash youngster a prayer. And then the impossible happened. After several rounds, Sonny Liston did not answer the bell. He remained on his stool, retiring in his corner, citing an inflamed shoulder. The most feared man in the sport had surrendered, and the 8-to-1 underdog had taken the title. The arena erupted in confusion, and the questions began almost instantly. Some said the injury was genuine, a torn-up shoulder that left him unable to continue. Others whispered something darker, claims that he had been drinking heavily the night before, that something about the whole affair simply did not sit right. No version was ever fully proven, but the legend of the unbeatable champion had cracked right there on that stool. If that first loss raised eyebrows, the rematch a year later would raise something far more troubling, a single punch that almost no one in the arena even saw. The rematch came in 1965, and it has never stopped being argued about since. This time, there was no slow unraveling, no surrender on a stool. This time, it ended in the first round, with Liston flat on the canvas after a blow so quick, so faint, that much of the crowd insisted they had never seen it land at all. People began calling it the Phantom Punch, and almost immediately, the suspicions of a fix took hold and refused to let go. To understand why so many believe the worst, you have to remember who Sonny Liston was and who had always stood behind him. Here was a fighter discovered behind prison walls, bankrolled from the start by men close to the underworld, managed for years by figures tied to the most notorious names in organized crime, names like Carbo and Palermo, men whose dealings were matters of public record and grand jury testimony. When a man with that history goes down to a punch nobody can see, the public does not reach for the simple explanation. It reaches for the shadows. And so every result of his now carried a question mark. The man who had once been the most untouchable figure in the sport had become something else entirely. A fighter whose defeats nobody quite believed, whose victories nobody fully trusted. His criminal world ties, once the advantage that opened every door, had curdled into a permanent stain. They turned each loss into a riddle, and each riddle into ammunition for a public eager to doubt him, and for the underworld figures who could always find a use for a man with secrets. His reputation, by the end of it, was no longer that of a champion. It was that of a question. And with the title gone and his name turned into a punchline, Liston drifted toward the one city in America that asked no questions and forgave no debts: Las Vegas. After the disgrace of that second Ali fight, Sonny Liston gave himself over to the temptations of Las Vegas. It was a city built for men with money and no peace, and he had become one of them. In those final years, he was often seen in the company of a notorious gambler named Irving Ash Resnick, a man whose very name tied Liston directly to the blurred and dangerous line where the casinos ended and the underworld began. Yet even then, he was still reaching for something more than the tables. In 1970, the aging fighter took a role in an action-adventure film called Moonfire, an effort to build a fresh public identity, to become something other than the fallen champion the headlines had buried. He was still, remarkably, a world-ranked heavyweight, even at this late hour. The fists still worked. The name still carried weight. But the man behind them was running out of road, and the city he had chosen was not a forgiving place. This is the backdrop that matters, because it is the stage on which his passing would play out. The Las Vegas of those years was a town with documented corruption running through its police department, with reported brutality against the black community, and with lines between organized crime and law enforcement so blurred that no one could always say where one ended and the other began. It was a place where a man could vanish into trouble, and where the truth could be quietly arranged. Into that environment walked Sonny Liston, illiterate, distrustful, surrounded by gamblers and shadows, owing favors he could not always repay. According to one persistent theory, in June of 1970, he was given an order he refused to follow, and in that town, refusing the wrong people carried a price that, some believe, may have cost him his life. Here we step carefully, because what follows is theory, not proven fact, but it is a theory that has shadowed his name for more than half a century. According to one version of events, Liston had fallen behind on debts he could not pay, and was pressured to throw a bout against a fighter named Chuck Wepner in June of 1970. The rumor holds that he refused. Some have pointed to that refusal as the original spark for everything that came after, the moment a desperate man told the wrong people no. It is important to be clear, this remains an allegation, a story passed through the years, never confirmed by any court or official record. What is certain is the strange, uncertain way his life ended. His passing is recorded as the 30th of December, 1970. But even that date is a kind of guess. The coroner could only place it somewhere between the 30th of December and the 4th of January, meaning that even the day Sonny Liston passed away is something no one can state for sure. For a man born without a recorded birthday, there is a terrible symmetry in leaving the world without a certain date of passing. Geraldine had been away, traveling out of state with the family. When she returned in the early days of January, she stepped into the silence we described at the very start of this story. The stacked newspapers, the soured milk, the rooms that had gone untouched for days. And in the bedroom, the man once feared above all others, lying still. What investigators found at that scene, and what they could not find, would launch a mystery that no coroner's ruling has ever managed to close. Because the evidence inside that quiet home did not tell a clean story. It told a tangled one, and to some who knew him, it told the story of a murder. When the first officers stepped through that door, they walked into a scene that should have closed the book on Sonny Liston. Instead, it opened a question that has never been answered. Among the first on the scene was Sergeant Dennis Caputo of the Clark County Sheriff's Department. As investigators moved through the home, they began to catalog what was there. In the kitchen, tucked inside a balloon, they found a small quantity of a forbidden substance. In the pocket of Liston's pants, a small amount of another. The early assumption took shape quickly, that the former fighter had passed away after a fatal dose of something he should never have touched. But here is where the story bent against itself. Because for all that was found in that home, something crucial was missing. There were no needles, no syringes, none of the equipment a man would have needed to deliver that fatal dose into his own body. How does someone die from an injected substance when not a single instrument used to inject it can be located anywhere in the house? To some, that absence screamed of a cover-up, of someone moving through those rooms before the police, clearing away whatever told the true story. Others offered a quieter explanation. Former Las Vegas Police Sergeant Gary Beckwith pointed out that in cases like this, it was not unusual for family members to go through a home and tidy things up, hoping to spare their loved ones the public shame of how a passing really happened. Both versions were plausible. Neither could be proven. And then came the human objection, the one raised by the people who had actually known him. Many of them insisted, flatly, that Sonny Liston was terrified of needles, that he never would have used such a substance, not ever, under any circumstances. The official ruling held to lung congestion and heart failure. The toxicology never confirmed a lethal amount of anything in his system. The cause of passing, in the end, was left hanging in a kind of permanent fog. Decades later, an investigative journalist would reopen the case file and argue something far more disturbing, that the passing of Sonny Liston was never truly investigated at all, and that the answer may have been buried on purpose. In 2016, the journalist Sean Asal published a book with a title that left no doubt about where he stood: The Murder of Sonny Liston. After years of digging through old records and tracking down those who had been near the end, Asal laid out a troubling case. He suggested that Liston may well have been murdered, and that, astonishingly, the crime was never properly investigated. It must be said clearly, no murder charge was ever filed in the passing of Sonny Liston. What Asal presents is a theory, a careful, well-documented one, but a theory all the same. He raises hard questions and does not pretend to answer all of them. By his account, a controlled substance was indeed found in Liston's blood, and Las Vegas police speculated that this pointed to a medical emergency. But the men and women who had been closest to the fighter never accepted that. To them, the idea that Sonny passed away by his own hand, by accident, in that bed, simply did not fit the man they knew. They believed to their core that he was lost, his life. This was not the first time someone had tried to make sense of the mystery. In 2000, the author Nick Tosches published The Devil and Sonny Liston, written while many of Liston's old acquaintances were still alive to talk. Tosches offered his own theory, his own posited path to that final night, a separate interpretation, the author's own, advanced as his reading of a clouded story rather than established fact. And this is what keeps the suspicion alive after all these years. The web around him was simply too thick to dismiss. The lifelong ties to organized crime, the conflicting evidence at the scene, a police force operating in an era of documented corruption, and, by one persistent theory, a man who had recently refused to do what powerful people wanted him to do. Those threads tied together, and you understand why the simplest explanation never satisfied anyone. The truth is, the real cause of Sonny Liston's passing remains one of boxing's greatest unsolved mysteries. And whatever happened in that bedroom, the way America chose to remember him afterward would deliver one final injustice, the kind that follows a man even into the ground. They laid him to rest at Paradise Memorial Gardens in Las Vegas, and on the marker over his grave, there were no titles, no record, no mention of the crown he once wore or the men he once flattened. There was only a single stark dedication, two words that somehow hold an entire life inside them. It reads simply, "A man." Sit with that for a moment, because the simplicity of it carries everything. After all the cruel labels, all the years cast as a brute and a menace, all the headlines that refuse to see him as fully human, that small plate in the desert ground claims back the one thing the world had so often denied him. Not champion, not villain, just a man. And what a fighter that man had been. The final ledger reads 54 professional bouts, 50 of them won, 39 of those by knockout, with only 4 defeats in an entire career. The Ring magazine would come to rank him as the 10th greatest heavyweight of all time. The respected boxing writer Herb Goldman placed him even higher, at 2nd. A senior editor at Sports Illustrated put him 3rd. In 1991, he was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame, his greatness finally carved into the permanent record of the sport. And yet, here is the quiet cruelty of how he is remembered. In all the decades since that mysterious end, Sonny Liston has never been embraced the way the giants around him have been. The honors, the warm retrospectives, the cultural affection given so freely to Muhammad Ali, to Joe Frazier, to George Foreman, to Mike Tyson, those things were never extended to him in the same measure. He was a man both feared and erased, a champion the public could not forget and would not celebrate. It all traces back to the same forces that shadowed him in life. His race, in an era that gave a black fighter no room to be complicated. His reputation, stained by the underworld that owned a piece of him from the start. And an age that no matter what he did, would never let him be anything more than the menace it had decided he was. Even the conscience he showed, even the title he earned, could not rewrite the part they had assigned him. There is a strange and aching symmetry to the life of Sonny Liston. He entered this world with no recorded date of birth, a sharecropper's son, so far outside the system that the system never wrote him down. And he left it the same way, his final day uncertain, his cause of passing contested, his body undiscovered for the better part of a week in a quiet Las Vegas home, a life that opened in mystery and closed in one. In between those two unknowns stood one of the most formidable figures the sport has ever produced, a man who could not read a newspaper but could end a championship fight in 2 minutes, a man shut out by a president and disowned by his own community, who still broke off a tour overseas because 4 little girls had passed away in a church, and his conscience would not let him stay silent. He was never the simple monster the headlines drew. He was something far more human and far more tragic. A man shaped by hard fields, hard hands, and harder company, reaching all his life for a respect that the world kept just out of his grasp. We may never know exactly what happened in that bedroom. The theories endure, the refused order, the missing needles, the journalist's reopened file, the friends who went to their own graves, certain he was lost his life. No charge was ever filed, no confession ever came. The fog the coroner left behind has never lifted, and at this distance, it likely never will. But perhaps the deepest mystery is not how Sonny Liston passed away. It is how a man this powerful, this gifted, this complicated, could be so thoroughly pushed to the margins of the sport he once ruled. The fists were real. The titles were real. The fear he struck into the greatest fighters of his day was real. And still, when they buried him, the world seemed almost relieved to look away. So let the last word be the one carved over his grave, claiming back what the era denied him. Not the brute, not the question mark, not the underworld's instrument. Just a man, feared, gifted, wronged, and finally, quietly, gone.